Hello, beautiful community. Am I audible? Part of the point of this is to take a few of your questions. It's going to be so casual, we won't even keep it up online. And then just check out if some of my new bed based live gear is actually working. Am I audible? Let me know in the chat if you're hearing me or if you're not hearing me. So it looks like yep. Okay, we're good. So let's begin to take a few questions. Um, a train full of dead Russian soldiers. Well, my view is that the Putin regime is entering probably irreversibly greater levels of turbulence with each block of a half year, let's say, going forward until the end of the regime. But the area where he still has some leeway, in my opinion, is casualties. Because of the radical depoliticization of Russian society, I put a sort of a cartoonish limit here for us on the table of about 500,000 dead Russian soldiers. And that's, of course, a frivolous number that I've just made up. But it's just something I'm putting on the table to give us an indication of the fact that if we consulted most experts today, they would all agree that the regime has nowhere near reached any kind of capacity, maximal capacity to carry casualties. There's a question about nuclear escalation in case the war doesn't go well. There we go. The big cat's asking, are we headed for a nuclear standoff when the Russian offensive fails? No, not necessarily. So I wouldn't put specific percentage points on nuclear risk, except as kind of psychological clues. I have this friend who I might bring on the chat channel at some point. He's just written a book about uncertainty, and he's obsessed with just going around and telling everybody, guys, let's not confuse the matter of managed risk with uncertainty. Because when we're dealing with risk management, we can say, well, this is a 60-70 sort of ballpark, this is a 2-3% sort of ballpark. When it's uncertain, we can't engage in this management of risk. So I would on the whole put nuclear risk in the realm of uncertainty, rather than a kind of risk we can calculate. But I don't think we're necessarily heading for some kind of nuclear standoff, but I do believe that we're going to get back to a predicament where we've got a lot of nuclear blackmail. There is the feeling now that we've left that behind, supposedly because we've personally threatened Putin's life, and supposedly because the Chinese have successfully put a kind of a block on Putin going there, because once Putin is essentially isolated vis-a-vis India and China, he's in real trouble. But I actually think that these are important factors. However, the reason that we're not getting a mass of nuclear threats and nuclear blackmail at the moment, like we did in September, for example, 2022, that's simply because the Putin regime thinks it's got quite a few strategic resources to leverage. For instance, mobilization, which can be escalated and dialed up now, the regime feels, without causing massive social instability, because they've tried it and there hasn't been much backlash. And so they're comfortable to do it again. So the main reason I would say that the nuclear threats have gone down is still to do with domestic Russian affairs, that they feel not confident about winning the war, but they feel confident they've got plenty of levers to pull um, uh, before they feel once again that they're sort of backed into a corner. And they were closer to feeling that in September. Um, about my work off YouTube, I'm going to talk in a personal question and answer session that's soon coming on the chat channel, because I've been collating personal questions for months and months, because I never answer personal questions like, do you have a pet? I'm going to do a Q&A just about these questions and about everything that's not YouTube. Um, yeah, so we've had a go at casualties. Russian culture appears, this is a super chat, appears to place a lot of emphasis on sacrifices which must be made. Would you agree with that statement, and how can that idea be challenged? The key way to challenge this idea, when it takes the form of the Russian population increasingly tolerating hardship that's a product of its regime's um, deranged and genocidal foreign policy, the key way to challenge this is to detach um, the myth of the Second World War from this brutal invasion of Ukraine. That's not going to solve the problem, but that's one thing that could exacerbate what you're asking about. The regime is going out of its way, and that goes all the way down to child education at school level, to persuade people that, in some sense, that doesn't even have to make rational, you know, be rationally compelling, as long as it sort of resonates with people emotionally. But in some sense, this is the continuation and finalization. This war is the continuation and finalization of the Second World War for Russia. I mean, that just makes absolutely no sense. But that's the kind of sentiment that the propaganda is trying to stoke. So that's one thing that I think, that if the regime fails to take that kind of further totalitarian turn, a part of which is persuading people that they're back in World War II, that'll help with this business of how much the Russian people are prepared to tolerate. The other pessimistic thing to say here is that, contrary to a lot of experts in the West, um, oppositional economic experts based in Russia, and people who are really, really good also looking in from outside, are enormously skeptical about economics driven protest potential bottom up. So the skepticism of that is quite universal when I check in with very authoritative economic experts. In other words, um, the people who are going to be worst hit economically by the calamity that Putin has started are going to be the poorest folks in Russia. But no matter how much poorer they get, we should remain skeptical about the odds of them um, participating in some kind of mass protest movement. If anything, further impoverishment will make them even more vulnerable to the regime's ghastly propaganda. So that's here's one way how to not make the situation worse, but here is another way in which we've got to recognize that even without it becoming worse, it's already bad. That the capacity for economic hardship to generate some kind of overturning of the Putin regime is really, really very low. And in fact, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a series of cracks at the top of the regime. And only after those happen are we likely to see anything at the bottom. Randy, thank you so, so much. There's a few more questions coming in. Let me have a look. Um, the Baltic states could be the next target of Russian aggression in an alternate universe in which Russia has the capacity to do this. I began to take my sort of public intellectual role and communication on this platform intentionally, I would say at the end of 2021. But I did make videos before, um, and most of them are not very good because I didn't even know what I was going to talk about. I just turned on the camera and spoke. There are a few videos on the channel from the past about Russia, and I think one of them is called something like "Probing Putin's Mind." I'm sitting in the beautiful countryside in Yorkshire, discussing some of my perspectives on Putin psychology over 2 years ago. And there, I am mostly worried about an invasion into the Baltic states. Um, and so I think that was really, really on the cards as a possibility, more than just a possibility. And in a way, Ukraine saved you guys. So I think now we're in a situation where the threat is very low, simply because of capacity. But do we need to have a very serious conversation, not just Eastern Europe wide, but Europe wide? All of Europe has to be part of this conversation. How do we make sure that nobody gets invaded by Russia 20 years from now? That's a very, very important conversation. And it's important to have it in a very strategic way and not allow ourselves to have sort of knee jerk moralistic reactions that might take us away from prudent considerations of how to ensure this. So, as far as capacity goes, no, we're not anywhere near as worried about the Baltics now. But as far as intent goes, if you abstract away capacity, yes. I mean, the Putin regime still feels that it has a kind of proprietorial claim essentially onto all of Eastern Europe. Um, do you think political support in Ukraine will fade if Russia makes battlefield gains? I think that um, there is a connection between um, the ghastliness of and the terroristic tactics of Russia's bombardment of Ukraine, Russia's assaults on Ukraine, and how pissed off the public gets, particularly in Europe. There's a very clear connection there. So, um, if we're going to keep seeing appalling pictures, we're going to keep reacting. I think, on the whole, in different parts of Europe. That doesn't mean there won't be fatigue setting in. Um, so, will there be fatigue? Yes, there will be fatigue, and the Putin regime is almost all in on this matter of Western fatigue. The Putin regime is saying, well, okay, you guys are going full throttle. If we stretch this out, let's see how this is going to look for you in 12 months. You know, you are democratic societies where things change, where things destabilize in quite short term periods. You have plenty of election cycles. We're going to wait and see. So that's the key political gamble of the Putin regime. The key um, approach of the Kremlin is that military victory, whatever that might mean, is a secondary aspiration in the sense that if they're going to have a military victory, it's going to have to come as the result of a kind of a political victory first, a political victory over the will um, um, and application of Western countries to keep involved and keep engaged. Piankovsky is a very interesting man to listen to, but he regularly makes um, claims that run 2 or 3 steps ahead of where we are. So, no, I would not be prematurely dismissing Prigozhin. What I would say is that this whole porridge of these radicals who are one day quarreling with each other, another day seemingly making up, from Strelkov to Prigozhin, um, that whole porridge is going to get more and more visible and more prominent and more of a nuisance to Putin in 2023. And he's going to have to more than ever make accommodations to it. often accommodations he doesn't want. So whatever we're seeing now, this picture is going to be a frequently changing picture. We're going to see one character rise to the top, then drop to the bottom, and maybe rise to the top again in this soap opera of the radicals in Russia. And this is going to be the domestic story in Russia in 2023. People who are more interested not in the war, but in a victorious war, which they believe Mr. Putin might not be able to deliver them. Maybe it's worth doing an episode on Arestovich. The, the basic sort of 2 cents, I would say, is that human beings sometimes make an extraordinary difference because they're very well motivated. Sometimes human beings make an extraordinary difference because they have mixed motives. And sometimes people actually make a very positive difference through ill motives. So some good things in the world happen through ill motives. And I think one of the problems with the Arestovich story is that too many folks are analyzing his intent, his um, enormous self-preoccupation, and enormous preoccupation with the romantic realization of his life project. Um, and they are looking at that as a problem. But what you've got to focus on isn't what motivates Arestovich, but what kind of impact he's had. And as a propagandist, in the good sense, because the righteous side in the war needs propagandists, he's had an extraordinary global influence and has made, I would say, a very significant contribution to Ukraine's predicament being comprehensible and sympathetic to people all over the world. And then over and above that, there is certainly a demographic of Ukrainians domestically um, who felt very calmed by Aristovich's communication in the first weeks of the war. And I would focus more on that than on some kind of quarrel about exactly what he's after and what his ambitions are. But I think all of this requires perhaps a bigger conversation in case people are interested. Um, let us have a look. Are there sources I might recommend for how Russian opinion on the war might be changing? Um, this is problematic because we do have polls in Russia, but polls are so difficult to do in a regime that is authoritarian and trending totalitarian, in a regime where the population is radically depoliticized, that they are either useless or they require the kind of specialist expertise to interpret that I don't have. And I say that as somebody who's done plenty of graduate level work, not in philosophy only, but also in comparative politics. Um, and it's just really, really difficult to get the correct interpretation of a poll. And there's a real risk that a journalist writing for a good publication will misunderstand what a poll in Russia means. There's very different motivations that people have for answering or not answering a poll. And you've got to be aware that polling just can't work in the same way in a society like Russia as it could, in Denmark. So is there anything that we could gather about the public opinion in Russia? Well, I do think that I'm making two tentative uh, assumptions about trends, maybe more than two, but at least two. The first one is that the radical group will get more radical. We're perhaps looking at a group that can carry over 10%, up to 20% of the population. I'm saying that some of those may become critical of Putin, increasingly and vehemently critical of Putin from the radical side. They might want more war and a more successful war. That's one trend. The other trend is that I think that the depoliticized blob in the middle that we put at 50 or 60% will become increasingly fearful and increasingly concerned about the war and increasingly fatigued by it. Um, that might not sound very lovely, but I think that's probably accurate. And the trouble is that I guess, this is just a guess, that the way that blob in the middle is gonna go, the more it finds out about how disastrous the situation is, it's gonna go more towards evasion and simply trying to stay out of the way of the regime rather than protest. So a kind of fatigue and um, self-protective retreat in the half of the population that's particularly depoliticized, and a kind of additional radicalization of the folks who are already pro-war. Apart from that, look, the sources I can recommend are just sources, which are um, please activate membership function. I'm thinking about it. I've got Patreon. I'm thinking about it. It just might confuse people if I do it, but I might, because some people might just find it more convenient to go straight through YouTube and not bother with anything external. So, but what I ultimately recommend is to find sort of 10, 12 sources that you kind of trust, who analyze the situation month by month and follow those. Um, that's difficult because some of them don't speak English, but some of them do. And we'll do a little update on the chat channel about who is good to follow. Um, I'm aware, I haven't read that book, Anatomy of Fascism. Um, I can't comment on it as a result. Um, I think that there are the more um, historically dense and academic definitions of fascism that are very important to take seriously. And it may be that by those standards, there are important ways in which Russia isn't a fascist society, isn't much of a fascist society, just society with fascist elements. But there are also kind of everyday, um, politically basic definitions of fascism that we've got to ask ourselves about, well, can we do without those? And some people say, well, actually, we should go without them because they're just confusing. But I say no. If we're constantly using a term, um, we're not going to stop using it. So we'd better improve the way we use it. So we'd better find this kind of sense of fascism that is very simple, very basic, to do with simple images like, um, is somebody going to come after me is somebody going to come and get me in the middle of the night if I disagree with the government? Um, and maybe a few other images like that as paradigms for whether your society is fascist or massively trending fascist. If I sit um, in Budapest and I criticize Viktor Orban, nobody's going to come and get me in the middle of the night. Yes, it's an authoritarian society in many ways now, but nobody gets. I'm not going to be picked up and sent to a labor camp in the middle of the night. But that could happen very easily in Russia or Belarus, and these differences are important. And I am not necessarily opposed to a kind of a cartoonish lane for the term fascism to be available and useful to us, so that we can ask basic questions about where we're at, where we're trending, and use that term constructively. Um, I discussed it a bit, I think, in one of my videos on the main channel. I give a few, 5 or 6 different definitions of fascism, and I suggest that we have to keep a kind of casual um, definition politically available, a sort of definition that is a kind of a football you can, with great roughness, throw about, um, without it losing shape, as it would do if it weren't a football, but with some kind of a fragile object that's got a very delicate, um, you know, delineation. Let's see. Um, yes, Russia did meddle in the Brexit referendum, but it's very important to not exaggerate that effect. And this creates a real problem for us. And I'm planning at some point a major video on it because people are really lost about how to deal with this. Because on the one hand, it's completely obvious that Russia doesn't have the power to cause major tectonic shifts in our democracies. On the other hand, they intervene, and their aspiration is to destabilize our democracies, and to not generate and seed new conflict, but to pour fuel on whatever conflict we already have in our societies. And we've got to be careful about how we think about this, because it would be very damaging for us to exaggerate their impact, but also be quite wrong to underplay it. And getting that balance right is really very important. I believe that Brexit is not necessarily a domestic story, but it's a story to do with certain global patterns of political transformation. And I would even put the political success, past and perhaps future, of Donald Trump together with Brexit. Not in every way, but in some ways. So there are patterns there that aren't really to do with malign foreign powers interfering. But to some extent they did, and we've got to strike that balance. And there's a real danger that we get very hysterical about the Russian interference. And we, as a result, just end up putting all things that we don't like in our societies and all things that terribly worry us to foreign interference. And that might make us drift through challenges without trying to get to the bottom of them. So it's a very difficult balance. I hope to talk about it properly in the future. Well, Russians are doing um, influence and disinformation campaigns all over. They're trying to intervene wherever they can. But each time we have to ask, what is the efficacy? What is the skill level? What is the transformational impact of that intervention? And also, what do we do for Western citizens, whether they're in Sweden or anywhere else, who fall for things? Um, and one of the dangers when a citizen in our country falls for Russian disinformation is we just scream disinformation and make this person out to be a fool and just alienate them and make them even further feel that whatever the establishment is against them and that the entire political system is against them. Instead, we need to say, well, what are the legitimate feelings that they have about what's going on in their country? So we've got to get beneath disinformation to distrust. So underneath disinformation, there's almost always distrust. Um, and that's why we should be extraordinarily careful about. I'm going to go even further. I think it's actually morally disgraceful to go around and label large parts of our populations who do fall for things that, at least in part, just Russian disinformation, um, label them foolish and ignorant and primitive. No, these are fellow citizens who have legitimate feelings about what's going on in their societies and who are losing trust for understandable reasons, and are feeling lost and are feeling powerless. And these are the emotions we've got to engage in rather than telling people off about how they are purveying disinformation. Um, I I do check my DMs in LinkedIn once a month, and I will get to a stage where everybody gets a reply. I'm just very, very behind. Let's have a look. Oh gosh. Is there a way back for Hungary? Um, yeah, but it's not looking good. Um, and so what we want to be careful about is that just as Hungary risks sliding further toward Belarus, although it's got an enormous way to go before it gets anywhere near that destination. But just as Hungary is sliding toward Belarus, we might worry that Italy or France might slide toward Hungary. And part of the answer to how far a country like Hungary will slide is going to lie with how far Italy, France, Belgium, the UK slide over the next decade. But this is a really, really important conversation. We're going to have it in great depth. I just said something about Aristovich, and all I said was we've got to distinguish his broadly significant and positive contribution to Ukraine's information war over the last few months from debates about his intentions. Um, um, I think a lot of the videos on 420 reveal a lot of the things we say. I think sometimes it's really important to pay attention exactly, which part of the country folks are being asked in. And it's also very important to recognize who isn't speaking, who isn't open to come forward. Um, but I think that I'm not in politics. I'm outside of politics line. If you watch any of the Vox Pop channel, I actually watched some Russian Vox Pop channels. But when you watch these channels, that line keeps coming back again and again and again and again and again. We're going to talk about the European Union, I think, separately. Do you think it's appropriate to show combat video? Do I think it's appropriate to show combat videos of Russian troops being killed? Um, with some of these things, when there's a war going on, you've got to understand that there's going to be a kind of economy of sentiment. So just because something feels partly wrong doesn't mean it's a complete no-go. But um, my own personal position on this is that the country that's engaged in an aggressive and genocidal war, um, and its soldiers might be committing various kinds of war crimes too. Just because that's going on does not mean that we have to dehumanize the soldiers. Um, I think if you're Ukrainian, you can, because if you're Ukrainian, I mean, I'm not saying you should, but if you're Ukrainian, I mean, this is just, different Ukrainians will have different imagery, but older Ukrainians might just feel, wow, this is the fascist invasion all over again. Um, you know, images of World War II. Um, so I am myself careful about how I portray Russian soldiers, and I don't call them mobics. Um, these are human beings in a very difficult predicament. They're in a difficult moral predicament because they're doing ghastly things and they're stuck with that moral um, um, uh, definition. Um, but also things are going to go very badly for them when they get back from the war if they survive it. So my approach is not is to be dignified, but I certainly don't go around telling other people how they should do it, especially if they're Ukrainian. Um, Relative time works. Without air force from the west, does Ukraine have the capacity to truly take out the Crimea bridge? This is just, I'm so sorry, this is just not a question I can answer. Um, I suspect I understand what the answer is, but I can't generate an opinion on it. It's just that would just be quite that would just be quite inappropriate. But if you want to throw in another question or even DM me another question, I'll be happy to respond. I'm aware you've dropped it as a super chat. I'm just so sorry I shouldn't comment on military matters. Um, what are my thoughts on Fukuyama? Um, Francis Fukuyama wrote an article in 1989, which became a book in 1992 called The End of History. And in that book, he roughly argued that in principle, if not in practice, um, we were moving toward a global civilizational convergence on a kind of model of democratic capitalism. Since then, almost year by year, Francis Fukuyama has watered down his position. And now there are even debates about whether Fukuyama might not have been right after all, um, because we're now seeing a kind of consolidation of the West and people getting more excited about democratic values. Um, I think that Fukuyama is profoundly wrong and profoundly important because, in a way, his book concentrated something that most of us were feeling at least some of the time. And I think that most people still feel the idea that eventually history will move forward. Eventually, the arc of history will bend in the right direction. And I think that is an illusion, but I think it's an illusion that has a hold over us very compellingly, such that it's hard to completely um, externalize it, get it out of our subconscious. And I think that means that Fukuyama, even the Fukuyama from 30 years ago, remains really important. But I'm afraid to say that the rest of this decade will do the opposite of vindicating him. He couldn't be vindicated anyway because even if things trend in a liberal democratic direction, that'll still be contingent, and contingency is not what Fukuyama is about. He wanted to delineate a kind of historical tendency, but even a contingent drift in kind of direction he was talking about ain't gonna happen this decade. And so that means that I do regard as the great optimists about progress as being conceptually wrong, and that includes Steven Pinker too, although Pinker makes the argument for different reasons. Have I read John Gray? Yes. So I'm right now at Snail Space, a book about a public intellectual called Isaiah Berlin. And John wrote a book about Isaiah Berlin in the mid 90s, and John knew Isaiah very, very well. And John was an exceptionally brilliant political theorist up until 2002. He became a public intellectual. He wrote a book called Straw Dogs that scandalized all his colleagues because it was full of sentences that seemed to everybody could only be half believed by John himself. But of course, that's not a weakness because John was consciously addressing himself to a general audience and trying to stimulate people to go in a certain direction, to go and challenge some of the um, prejudices that were taking people out of orbit. So the way John works is, what are the 2 or 3 major misconceptions in society today? Let me take those and pull with an exaggerated sort of motion in the opposite direction, maybe going too far, but that's what I'm going to do. So that's how he works. And I still regard him as being unsurpassed as a public intellectual in Britain today. CP361, thank you very much. Robinson Mitchell, thank you so much for your comment. Let's have a look at it. To Putin's inner circle, the option of taking down Putin, repudiating human Putinism, rolling back his repressions, freeing political prisoners, and ending the war must begin looking attractive. No, it doesn't look attractive at this point. So the majority of the reports in Western media about how this person is challenging Putin or that person is challenging Putin are, to put it mildly, exaggerations. Most of the dancing that's happening is still dancing about being in a certain position vis-a-vis Putin. And the criticism that you sometimes hear toward Putin, indirectly often, from various radicals in Russia, is still very, very strategic. And it's based on the assumption that Putin is the center, that he'll remain the center part of it for a long time. That I'm not saying that's right, but that's their approach. And the reason that's so, primarily, is that Putin is the only political institution in Russia with perceived legitimacy. So the problem is, if you remove Putin, it's not going to be clear what kind of situation these people are going to be in and what kind of state the regime will be in. It's not clear to these people that if you remove him, there is going to be a boat for them to drive without him. So I think that your comment is something that we hope might be true a couple of years from now. It's not true today. Is the responsibility for high mistrust in institutions in the West primarily on the institutions themselves, or bad actors that often create shadow institutions? No. You see, I don't think that the challenges Western democracies face are to do with people we might describe as bad actors, or to do with people who we might describe as actors who want to break the democratic game, actors who are motivated to break the judiciary or to overstay in office, to transcend the counter-majoritarian checks and balances, including the business of rotating elections. I actually think most of these bad agents are a product of the crisis of trust and not the cause of it. I think that the crisis of trust is partly to do with the fluidity of societies in a globalized world that makes it very hard for us to generate enough homogeneity in the way we think about ourselves as citizens who belong to a single polity. I think that since the early 70s, there's also been this trend of disempowerment, that people feel that they can't inflect the political process, that they've got some levers, it may be an election, they pull them, but nothing happens. There's a sense of powerlessness. And increasingly, there's a sense of betrayal. There's a sense that some kind of outsiders might be being prioritized over one. And then there's just this sense of being lost. When you look at political institutions, they just don't make any sense. So that kind of crisis of trust is something we've got to dig deep into. And we can't put it down to just bad political actors. And then there are two views about institutions. You either say that institutions that are sick need to be helped to recover if they possibly can, or you say you want to replace them. And I always recommend the approach that says, yes, if you do think the New York Times is failing badly, the solution has got to be a better New York Times rather than getting rid of it and replacing it with 73 Matt Taibbis on Substack. There is this very important argument about institutions, even if one agrees that certain institutions are struggling. For example, you could argue that the mission of the New York Times in the United States should be to speak to the whole country. It's not in a position to fulfill that mission. To that extent, it's an institution that's struggling, even though it might not be struggling financially. But the answer always has to be, in my opinion, better institutions. But this is a debate worth having, and we will have it. Um, Oh gosh, this video is so jumpy that I'm not sure it's worth leaving it up. I'll leave it up. I'll leave it up for a bit. Um, it's just, oh, everybody wants it up. Yeah, I'll leave it up for a bit, but it's a bit too casual to bring enormous value to people who watch it a week from now. Um, no, I don't know anything in the last few days or weeks about Karamurza. Um, Karamurza is obviously different to Navalny because um, Navalny is genuinely taking on the Putin regime, and Karamurza is doing that too. But what Karamurza is fundamentally saying is that what's happening is unconscionable for me, and I cannot ethically accept it. I'm going to stand up for it, whatever the consequences. Whereas Navalny is playing a long distance game of political strategy, which he hopes he can win. And Karamurza is just taking um, an inspirational, fundamental moral stance against the regime. Um, most institutions in the West that are struggling, um, thank you, Bradiation. I am going to say something brief. Most institutions in the West that are struggling um, are playing defense, to use an Americanism. So let's take the BBC in the UK. The BBC is concerned that there's a crisis of trust and that people are losing trust in the BBC rapidly. Historically, the approach of the BBC has been to play defense. And my argument that needs to be made really three-dimensionally is that institutions that play defense lose in the end. That you have to figure out what you're going to stand for, and you have to intransigently stand for that, while at the same time trying to speak to all citizens. So standing up for what you're doing intransigently does not mean you pick a side. It just means you pick some values and you stand by them firmly, while nevertheless trying to understand that you are an institution that is about all Brits and not just some Brits. Um, there's plenty of ways in which the institutions can improve. I mean, for instance, the institutions um, that take a position in the culture wars on certain key hot points in the culture wars could stop taking those positions, particularly if they nowhere near represent what the majority of the population thinks. Um, these institutions could also start to think bigger picture beyond themselves, because very often when things are not going well and when there's loss of trust in a particular institution, you to feel like a fortress and you want to close up and just save yourself. But the right approach is actually to look at these broader patterns of democratic destabilization and distrust and engage with them and understand that you're part of this current that you've got to keep analyzing. And so you've got to open yourself up to the challenges rather than um, in you know end up in a kind of enclosed survival mode, and you palpably feel this. So some of these institutions I know a bit, from inside too, you palpably feel this sense of, oh my, the winds are blowing in the wrong direction, the clouds are gray. Let's, button up the hatches and survive this. But no, you've got to lead. So these institutions have to lead. But I mean, you're talking about the IPCC here. One of the really important challenges for the climate movement um, over the next few years will be to become um, more culturally and ideologically available to all citizens. That's going to be a very, very important aspiration, whereby the climate movement will need to say, look, um, you can take this and that position politically and join us, but you don't have to. You can also take that other position and join us too. At the moment, the climate movement is too much of a train where people have to jump for the right reasons. There's plenty of people who would jump on if you allowed them to jump on for reasons that are at the moment frowned upon. And we've got to realize this very, very clearly. There's going to be hard right pro climate action politics 10 years from now. That seems strange to people, but this is going to happen. And in fact, there are going to be um, anti-democratic pro-climate political forces. So this is nowhere near what's happening now. I mean, you've got plenty of hard right people who are screaming about the climate crisis on the internet, but they've got small followings. But this is going to become political mainstream in the next 10, 20 years. We're going to have to deal with that. And there's a real tendency that the climate movement thinks that everybody is going to be left wing and center left, and that's going to be and into identity politics, and that's going to be how they're going to be able to go on. And they won't. That's just not going to happen. But this is just briefly to touch on this, and there's so much more to say. The insight on the private armies that are formed in Russia is that if you start looking at Chechnya, if you start looking at Prigozhin's group, you are looking at slow disintegration of this business of the state retaining a clear monopoly over organized violence. And if things begin to go very turbulently in Russia, we don't know what's going to be on the cards with Prigozhin's folks. I mean, they could have an enormous amount of power to take things over. I'm stretching it here, but Putin is dismantling the very authoritarian state he built in many ways, and it does not bode well for Russia's prospects of avoiding civil war and avoiding breakup. Let's see. What do you think of Navalny's past racist and problematic statements, as pointed out by Kamil Galiev? Kamil Galiev's thread on this I didn't like. Navalny you've got to be gentle. Kamil is young. He's 29, 30, 29, something like that. So I'm not a fan of... Kamil is universally bashed by academic experts. 9 out of 10 academic experts bash up on Kamil. Give him a break, give him the possibility to evolve, and he's saying a lot of very interesting things. Often he's saying things that are wonky. But I'm not somebody who is interested in beating him up. I'm interested in encouraging him. Navalny said a whole bunch of bad stuff, but we've got to be clear about what he said and what he didn't say, right? And we've also got to be clear about what he has taken back, what he's apologized for, what he's acknowledged, and what he hasn't. And there's a sea of misinformation about this. I mean, for example, how many people in this community know that as soon as Crimea was annexed, immediately Navalny came out and said that it was completely unacceptable and illegal? Now, my personal views on Navalny don't matter. The more you approach a dynamic where we're looking at Navalny in a pool of democratic candidates under relatively privileged conditions, the more I'm going to be disinclined to vote for him personally. But what I would tell you is it's an ethical disgrace that is widespread on the internet right now to conflate support for Navalny as a political candidate under ideal conditions with support for Navalny as somebody who is being tortured in jail by Putin's ugly regime and who from that jail is constantly making anti-war declarations. So you cannot conflate these two ways of morally evaluating Navalny. There's a great deal more to say about this because I've been asked to read a thread, I think, by Ukraine explainers on Navalny and react to it, and I may or may not do that. Um, but clearly, please make this distinction between supporting Navalny as a political candidate and supporting him as a man who's taking on the Putin regime in many ways single-handedly. Well, China's significance in one respect is going to be expressed by the fact that what Putin is doing is he's increasingly dragging Russia into becoming a satellite state of China, a junior and pathetically dependent partner, if partner at all. There's plenty more to say, but why did I say I won't lose my rudder? Um, so most political YouTubers tend to lose their rudder after a while, and it's a process of audience capture and a process of algorithm capture. And what you see is this has happened to channels with millions of subs, happened to channels with hundreds of thousands of subs. The change is normally very, very small, imperceptible. It's like an inch a month. But then if you take a break from their channel, you come back a year later, whoa. Oh, 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 wow. And that's very common phenomenon. It's very difficult to avoid. I had a fight actually with a colleague the other day who is a professional philosopher who doesn't use a single social media platform. He has a bit of a following on Twitter, but he doesn't use a single social media platform. He just posts randomly. So he doesn't really think about these matters of algorithm capture. And he said, well, look, if you have integrity, that's not going to happen to you. You're not going to lose your rudder. And I said, not at all. Most people who lose their rudder have integrity. What they don't have is the requisite stability. So it's a matter of psychological stability, and it's also a matter of your intellectual life being grounded off YouTube. What I think about the world will not move a millimeter as a consequence of what YouTube analytics graphs show. But do I believe that's pretty weird and freakish? Unfortunately, I do. And we've got to talk about exactly how this capture works because I'm passionate that this is not about people not having integrity. It's about people not having stability. That's different. The problem with all of this is that YouTube's algorithm, which has helped us to connect together, has also got this extraordinary problem to it, which is that um, if two channels speak and one channel is terribly worried about the message of the other channel, the audience of the other channel whose message one's worried about may come over and become part of your audience, and then YouTube will pump your videos to them. They're not going to watch them, and your channel is going to begin to die off. And so that's why this is very strange predicament whereby you've got somebody like me who's happy to speak to virtually anybody, but at the same time there are these real problems of audience interpenetration that you've got to be very considerate about. Um, and let me give a benign example of this and not talk about, I don't know, pandemic management or anything like that. Um, let's say that I talk about picking mushrooms. Um, and I go and do a joint big podcast with a channel that does furniture repair. Well, if lots of furniture repair fans come over to my channel, they're going to be showing mushrooms. They're going to subscribe, but they're not going to watch, and this will dramatically affect the direction of my channel, and that creates a problem for YouTubers with different perspectives and different audiences speaking together, and that encourages YouTubers to speak to people who they already completely agree with. Let's have a look. But this is just a drop in the ocean compared to what needs to be said about this extraordinary crisis of algorithm capture. um, how does one come up with a positive image of a future for Russia? Vodka, for sure. If one doesn't really have access to opinion of the Russian population, um, we have broken access to the opinion of the Russian population. We know that many of them are depoliticized. But um, the positive picture you paint has got to be either a picture of a more federalized Russia that stays together, that takes some kind of a democratic opportunity or partial democratic opportunity, or, which is much harder, you've got to paint some kind of a picture of a relatively benign breakup of the country, which one important scholar at the moment is sort of doing, but it's still a minority sport. So you do it in two steps. First of all, you acknowledge that it's possible. You reject the idea that it's completely impossible. Russia had democratic opportunities. Its best one was in the 1910s, and that one was really apt for taking, and it didn't take it. It had an opportunity in 1991, had an opportunity in 1999, less so. Um, these opportunities were hard to take. They were just about takeable. And there will be just about takeable opportunities in Russia in the future. But when it comes to that, the country needs to have the resources to take it. And the country also needs to have, at that time, an elite of some kind that is able to constructively engage the country in a fruitful conversation with itself. That's one of the challenges. But I do insist that we can't write countries off with a kind of historical determinism. But the situation is not going to be prone to optimistic analysis for the near future. Um, can um, can poorer, well, this might not be quite on topic for us. Can poorer countries build just societies domestically without global change to economic and political relationships? Well, yes and no. I mean, yes and no. Um, Absolutely central to the question you're asking is going to be how the climate challenges that we're going to face over the next decades are going to be managed by the major states, what kind of international negotiations and agreements we're going to have. Um, and this affects everything, including war. I mean, there's going to be many climate mediated wars in the future, too. So, most conversations about um, social justice um, in poorer societies, most conversations about global justice are going to have to go through this filter of how um, we are dealing with the climate crisis. But there's, of course, so much more to say about your important question. Maybe I could tackle it when we spend a bit more time talking about not just Russian authoritarians, but also um, Western democracy and different political systems in different parts of the world. Let's have a look at question marks. Um, I shouldn't answer that question. Are climate challenges such a big factor, or are they more of an ideology? I think they're a big factor, but I think that requires a separate conversation. I don't want to legislate that right now. but I do think they're a big factor. I even think that there's a bit of climate thinking in Putin's war. Um, and it's not necessarily a climate denial, um, a denial of the climate science. It's that Putin wants the West to stop implementing climate policy. And that is actually part of, not a top three factor, but it's part of what's driving um, this war. Putin thinks, well, either the climate science is real, but we don't have to take it seriously, and we can sort of break the Western consensus that we need to take action on it, or the climate science isn't real, and then the Western consensus on it is just words, and we've got to break that too. I think Putin is inclined to agree that climate science gets the world right. Um, Thank you so much for saying that I'm amazing. So I don't think Putin is a climate science skeptic, but he is a climate policy skeptic. Um, how come breakup of Russia is discussed so often? I'm an expat, but I never felt that we should be independent from Moscow. So look, I think that the best source on this is the wonderful academic who's based in Vienna now, Alexander Etkind, who most of the time speaks in Russian. I might have him on the channel in 2023. I do think that in some ways the risk of breakup is real, but I also think that many conversations about breakup are not constructive. They are just, oh, we want to get rid of Russia as a problem, so wouldn't it be good if they broke up? But that doesn't have political substance. That's just a kind of emotional and moral exclamation. So there's a great deal of that going on that's detached from reality. But then at the same time, I think there are also conversations about the prospects of Russia breaking up. I don't think anybody thinks it's imminent. I don't think anybody thinks it's overwhelmingly. No, people do think it's overwhelmingly likely. Some people do think that. But what I will say, Sergey, is that I do find that a lot of very serious experts do take the possibility as real. For example, Greg Uden, whose work I highly recommend, is somebody who would take this prospect entirely seriously. So we've got to talk about it, but we've got to talk about it in a real way. And there's a lot of dream, fiction about this. And there's a real risk that the exiled Russian opposition overstates the case about how likely this is. So that's true too. Yeah, part of the problem with Russian polls, Alex, is that the response rate is so low, it's often under 5%. But that's not the only reason why we can't trust the polls. There's so many other reasons. To just name one, Russians, as a sociological fact, seem to believe that pollsters are owned by the government, even when they're not. And so they think that the regime is calling them and asking them, do you support Putin? So there's plenty of reasons why Russians give answers to pollster questions that can't be interpreted the way we interpret these answers, in Iceland. Rhetoric in the media has shifted more toward pro-war. You mean in Germany, pro-supporting Ukraine? Great. Well, great, not as in likely, but great as in significant. Yes, there is a significant chance of a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. And certainly, almost all the major powers in the West are spending a lot of time thinking about how to avoid that. And that's part of the reason why so many of the weapons that Ukraine is getting, it's getting with massive delays and in drip form. I personally believe that we could have given Ukraine more support, um, and that the risk would have been acceptable, the risk of escalation. But there's a permanent risk of escalation because war is an environment of uncertainty. Just about anything can happen, and very often incidents that weren't intentionally brought about can lead to escalatory steps. So it's a risk, and it's not possible to say that there is zero nuclear risk over the months to come. It's just not possible to say that, but it's something we've got to keep um, in mind. And I do think that even as um, some Western governments have woken up more to the possibility of Ukraine winning, the key priority still of certainly the Biden administration still is avoiding nuclear war. That's not talked about publicly much, but still the key priority of the United States is avoiding nuclear war here. So we're not in a situation where we have politicians who are unaware of these risks. These risks are there, and we just hope that they're being appropriately managed. But it's hard because this is a democratic process, and politicians are also responding to what the public wants as well. Um, but as I say, I am in the camp that Ukraine needs even more support than it's getting. Adam, how do I feel I'll take this question broadly about the eligibility of individuals for public office. Let's take a page out of Russian history in the 1990s. What happened was that, cartoonishly speaking, in 1996, democratic forces in Russia won undemocratically. It looked like the Communist Party might win. And the election that took place was, in part, an exercise in suspending democratic procedure to preserve democratic procedure in the future. Most people retrospectively agree that that backfired and contributed to the evolution of Putinism. So let me change topic a little bit. When we're talking about excluding Donald Trump from either social media platforms or indeed from public office, that Russian story is a very important story for us to pay attention to. There's a real risk in trying to suspend democracy to preserve democracy, because that might, in the end, not help us preserve democracy in the medium term. Sorry that I took it out of your hands and I broadened it out like this, but I think that's the key challenge we're going to repeatedly face in the West, whereby we're going to have politicians who are operating within the democratic scheme of things because our checks and balances still work, but who we feel instinctively want to break those checks and balances. And there's going to be a real instinct to stop them. And very often that instinct will be acted upon. And I fear that often that might be indeed counterproductive. But it's a lose-lose situation. I'm happy to come back to your question again. I'm sorry that I broadened it out so much. Lots of questions. Keith, the loss of Crimea would matter to Russian public opinion because there is something in the subconscious, something of that Crimean myth. And that's what I tried to argue in that video a couple of weeks ago with the help of Andrei Zorin's writings, the great Russian historian. So it won't look good to the Russian people if Putin loses Crimea, and that would existentially endanger his stay in power, if not immediately, then with a little bit of a delay. Um, I'm sorry that I'm not able to catch all of the questions. If it's fair to say that Western democracy can only save itself through education and particularly epistemology, do you know if then who is currently having that conversation scholastically? Um, the best scholarly I disagree with the premise, I'm afraid. I don't think it's about well, it depends. When you said epistemic, it sounded to me like we were talking about disinformation. I worry about over focusing on disinformation and not looking at the trust issues underneath. Um, Patricia Nance in Germany is a very important um, political theorist who is doing good work. I believe that in recent years, the most important work on democratic regeneration has been done by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, whose many lectures you can find on YouTube. Just search democratic degeneration and Charles Taylor. Is communism still relevant to the Russian consciousness? Ethical nostalgia about communism is. But the Communist Party isn't a communist party, it's just a branch of the Putin regime that plays a particular role the regime tells it to play. There is no independent Communist Party of any substance in Russia. There is nostalgia for the Soviet period. And what is really fascinating is that sometimes nostalgia can skip generations. So um, the pattern might be that there's a communist nostalgia in people of a certain age. Then their children break out of that nostalgia, but then their children's children reconnect with that nostalgia. And sometimes what allows you to reconnect with that nostalgia is just not having a clue at all about what the Soviet Union was like. I caught the Soviet Union at the end of it, and trust me, you don't want to be there. I mean, I remember as a school kid calling shops in the mid to late 80s, and asking if they had basic produce, and they just didn't. In Moscow, there always was bread and one basic dairy product, butter, but all meats were missing. Cheese was missing. 95% of things you could eat were missing. Um, and the state was just grinding to a halt. It was becoming a sort of a machine where you move the levers, but nothing happened. Um, so it's very important to keep it real about what the Soviet Union was like, and also how poor people were, actually, um, and how stressful things were, um, and how stressful it was to get along and not be stumped out by the state for some reason, and how corrupt it was, and how everything was about bribes. Um, it wasn't pretty. And you've got to be realistic about that. And there's quite a bit of nostalgia still that may even be going up as we have a generation who can just make it up because they haven't seen it at all. Could I speak about Nemtsov one day, please? Yes, I will speak. I mean, he was killed in February. Wow. So nowish, February 2015. He was probably the most Russian of the good Russian politicians. Um, an enormously charismatic and amiable and likable man with integrity and flaws. Yeltsin eyed him up as a possible successor. Um, Yeltsin once, I think, told Thatcher that Nemtsov might be the next president of Russia. Um, and eventually, there just was no space for a politician like him. And one of the questions that I saw right at the beginning of this live was, could things have been done differently during the Putin regime to avoid this mess? And I think one of the painful truths to admit is that maybe more could have been done to challenge the regime institutionally earlier on. Um, Gleb Pavlovsky, who's an ex Putin strategist, but now is very much opposed to Putin. I think Gleb is really sick at the moment, so we wish him health. But Gleb Pavlovsky is of the view that the Russian opposition in the early 2010s took to the streets too early and gave up on institutional warfare with the regime too readily. And there was still space to battle with the regime within an institutional structure rather than evacuating it and becoming street activists. Um, so there's plenty of counterfactuals about what could have been done. Um, uh, we're going to talk about uh, maybe I'll share an opinion on Nate for another time. I mean, I'll remember your super chat, and you can DM me to remind me. Will Alexei Navalny walk as a free man if he doesn't die and if he isn't killed? But he won't walk until the Putin regime is over. If Putin watched my videos, he would think that I'm very naive because I believe in things that aren't real, like democracy. Democratic forces in Russia are non-existent. It's a completely authoritarian dynamic in which there's very little you can do, but that's even going to get worse. And there's even a chance that people who are trying to stay out of politics, that they're going to be affected too, because the regime might want everybody to support them if it takes a more radical totalitarian turn than it's taken so far. But what I would say is that up to 20% of the Russian population feel that the regime is kind of at war with them. They know that if they say what they think, their lives are going to be over. This, of course, raises the question of protest, but I'm going to say that we've talked about it several times and we'll talk about it again. What are the limitations on the possibilities of protest in Russia today? Of course, people know that if they come out, they're just going to be taken away. The regime, the Putin regime today, is not like the Lukashenko regime in 2020. It's more stable and it's got better vertical control. So it'll be damn hard to shift it now by protest. If 500,000 people came out onto the street, the regime would still be there, but these people wouldn't. But we've got to talk in more detail about protest, because I also don't want to say that it's impossible, because how possible and how efficacious protest is of course in part connected with how efficacious people think it is. Name pending, thank you for wishing me well. Are people being killed for speaking out? Well, people are trying to not speak out, but people would be killed or tortured or imprisoned for speaking out. Yes. I'm going to take a couple of more questions, and then um, I'm going to send my love and say goodbye. I'm working on a special video for the main channel. It's something that's so important to talk about, but it's very hard to talk about it, to do with wars and human beings doing really destructive things. How would Putin view a peace deal in which Crimea remained in Russian hands as a victory? Um, he wouldn't view it as a victory. He wants more. He wants everything. He just knows he can't have it yet, but he hopes he'll be able to have it in the future. Uh, you don't need to like Tarkovsky's Stalker, but it is a flawed masterpiece. If Putin is ousted from office, will a NATO-led re-education program be necessary for Russians to come to terms? No, no. If Putin is ousted from office, it's going to be Russia dealing with the mess, and it's going to be a domestic failure or success in dealing with it. It's not going to work in any other way. It can't be done externally. The West has a disastrous history of trying to do that. Um, I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic um, about. I'm pessimistic about this, but whatever happens is going to have to be domestic. So, beautiful humans, we're going to call it a day for the moment. I'm very grateful to you for being with me. Haven't decided if we'll keep it up. We'll definitely keep this up for a while for people who have missed it. Um, and I'm really, really excited about the next conversation I want to have with you on the main channel. I'm not sure how soon that will be, hopefully in just a few days, but we'll keep connected through the chat channel and through lives. Meanwhile, how does the war end? Last question. We don't know. We know that it'll end really, really badly for the Putin regime. So we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for being with us and with me, and lots of love till next time. Bye bye.